Manipulators don't control your mind, they control your ego. And once they understand what your ego wants to feel, the rest becomes surprisingly easy for them. A skilled manipulator begins with observation. They listen more than they speak. They study reactions. They notice what makes someone feel appreciated, admired, respected, or understood. And once those emotional signals become visible, the manipulator begins shaping their personality around them. If the target values kindness, the manipulator appears compassionate. If the target values intelligence, the manipulator appears thoughtful. If the target values spirituality, the manipulator appears morally sincere. If the target values loyalty, the manipulator speaks about honor, commitment, and shared values. Psychologists call this technique mirroring. So do you think you're so smart and intelligent that you will never fall for other people's manipulation tactics? And it's normally just foolish people who fall in their traps. Let me tell you something. You are wrong. Because the manipulator doesn't target foolish people. Often, it's the intelligent ones who fall into their trap. It's not because of our intellect, it's because the ego is what makes us easy to control. Let me start with a story. Imagine discovering that the person you have spoken to every day for many months never actually existed. The photographs were stolen, the identity was fabricated, the affection was scripted. The person who told you they loved you, the person you believed you were building a future with, turns out to be someone operating behind a fake profile on the other side of the world. And the person who believed every word was not a fool, not naive, not unintelligent, but an intelligent professional who simply trusted the wrong person. Stories like this appear in the news constantly now across Europe, America, and Asia. Billions of pounds are lost every year through romance scams. These love fraudsters who coerce people online by manipulating them and deceiving them, telling them that they love them, they want to marry them. And whenever people hear these stories, the reaction is usually the same. How could someone fall for that nonsense? It sounds like a reasonable question. I've read many of these stories. There's even documentaries online, even films made on real life case studies where you see normal, intelligent people who are hooked into these manipulative traps, and they end up losing maybe years of their life and sometimes, thousands and thousands of pounds in the scam. What this shows us is that this hides a deeper misunderstanding about how manipulation actually works. Most people assume manipulation succeeds because someone failed to think clearly. But manipulation rarely defeats intelligence. What it does, it bypasses it. Just remember one thing, manipulators don't control your mind, they control your ego. And once they understand what your ego wants to feel, the rest becomes surprisingly easy for them. A skilled manipulator begins with observation. They listen more than they speak. They study reactions. They notice what makes someone feel appreciated, admired, respected, or understood. And once those emotional signals become visible, the manipulator begins shaping their personality around them. If the target values kindness, the manipulator appears compassionate. If the target values intelligence, the manipulator appears thoughtful. If the target values spirituality, the manipulator appears morally sincere. If the target values loyalty, the manipulator speaks about honor, commitment, and shared values. Psychologists call this technique mirroring. So they mirror your technique. The manipulator reflects the emotional desire of the person they are studying. And suddenly the connection feels extraordinary. The victim begins to believe they have met someone who truly understands them. They've met their soulmate, someone who shares their values, someone who sees them perfectly aligned with their own values. And what they have actually encountered is not authenticity, it is a reflection. A reflection that which has been created deliberately to manipulate the target. The most dangerous manipulator is not the one who disagrees with you. It is the one who looks exactly like you. Because when someone appears to share your values, your guard drops without you noticing. This is exactly how so many romance scams unfold. The conversation begins casually, a message appears online, perhaps on social media, or even on a dating platform. And nothing dramatic. It just seems like a friend request. Somebody just sends you a message which doesn't come across suspicious, but the manipulator is already studying the emotional landscape. They've already know their target. They learn what disappointments the person carries, what emotional baggage they're carrying. They learn what hopes they still hold. They learn what kind of affection or admiration makes the other person feel valued. And slowly, they begin offering exactly that. Encouragement appears during difficult moments. Empathy appears when the pain or past pain is discussed. Compliments appear exactly when the person feels insecure. Sometimes they play the long game. Weeks pass, even months perhaps. The conversations then start to occur daily. The manipulator remembers birthdays, emotional wounds, family details, tiny fragments of life. The connection begins to feel real for the target, the victim. And this is the moment the psychological trap begins closing. Because once the ego becomes emotionally invested in the story, admitting the story might be false becomes painful. Small inconsistencies may appear, strange explanations, delayed promises, but the mind begins to protect the emotional reward that has been created and sort of developed around this online relationship. It's probably just stress. The situation is unusual. I know what it looks like, but this is different. The moment the ego wants something to be true, the mind begins rationalizing and defending the illusion. And once that happens, the manipulator no longer needs to work as hard. The victim begins protecting the illusion themselves. Manipulators are very, very clever in their craft. Manipulation becomes even more powerful when it operates inside groups rather than relationships. This is where cult movements offer some sort of clearer examples. When people hear the word cult, they often imagine irrational followers who abandon critical thinking, but history shows us something far more uncomfortable. Many cult movements have affected and attracted highly intelligent individuals, doctors, lawyers, engineers, highly educated people, even university students, people perfectly capable of critical reasoning. So how do cult leaders manipulate intelligent people? This alone is a masterclass if you truly understand this. They do not begin with extreme beliefs, they begin with meaning. Most cult leaders present themselves as individuals with unusual insight. They claim to offer clarity in a confusing world. They promise purpose. They promise transformation. They promise belonging. For someone searching for direction or meaning, that promise can feel powerful. And the environment created around the leader reinforces that feeling. New recruits are welcomed warmly. They are praised. They are sort of told or groomed that they have unusually high potential. They are very intelligent. This stage is often described as love bombing. So love bombing doesn't just happen on online sort of romantic scams. This is exactly the same principles at play here. The psychology is exactly the same that the cult leader is using as the manipulator who is romancing somebody online fraudulently and basically trapping them. So in the cult, the new member receives overwhelming admiration and attention. People listen carefully, they compliment them, they treat them as someone valuable. So imagine that you are being appreciated. That admiration becomes the emotional hook. And this is what slowly begins to trap them. So the first step of manipulation is really criticism. It is admiration. Because admiration creates attachment, and attachment creates influence. And it's this influence that the manipulator then has over their target, which allows them to manipulate their behavior and direct them to their desired outcome. Gradually, in a cult, the recruit spends more time with the group, less time with their friends and family members who are outside of that cult, less time with family, more time attending meetings, discussions, and gatherings organized by that particular community which they've started to feel part of. Slowly, the group becomes more than a social circle. It becomes identity. And once identity becomes tied to a belief system, questioning that belief begins to feel like questioning the self. And this is where manipulation becomes deeply powerful. You need to understand that this kind of manipulation has various different strategies. And the strongest manipulation tactic is not to control the behavior first. It is to reshape that person's identity. Because once identity shifts, behavior follows naturally. And once that identity becomes part of that person's belief system, then you can easily manipulate that person in accordance with the new identity that they have formed. Let's look at a modern example of this dynamic which appeared in an organization which is known as, through its letters, NXIVM. This is an organization which presented itself as a leadership and personal development program. It was targeting entrepreneurs, executives, actors even, and professionals seeking self-improvement. All these different types of people attended their seminars that promised growth and empowerment. At the beginning, the program appeared sophisticated and inspiring, but gradually the structure became more controlling. Members devoted increasing time to the organization. Criticism of the leader became discouraged. Loyalty became central. By the time many members realized the manipulative nature of the group, their friendships, identity, and professional network had already become tied to the organization. So leaving that organization meant losing far more than a belief system. It meant losing an entire social world. And the psychological cost of that was potentially enormous. So manipulation becomes powerful when leaving feels more painful than staying. Think about that for a moment. Manipulation is not limited to cults or scams. It can appear in workplaces as well. It can appear in friendships. Imagine a charismatic leader arrives promising opportunity and success. Employees feel inspired. They feel recognized. They feel appreciated. But gradually, the environment shifts. The questions become unwelcome. The criticism becomes interpreted as disloyalty, and approval becomes scarce. Employees begin adjusting behavior, not because they believe the leader is always correct, but because approval has become valuable for them. And once that approval becomes valuable, influence becomes powerful. This is a workplace masterclass of how to manipulate people. As I've mentioned before, manipulation often begins with admiration, and it slowly leads to control. So it starts with something positive and ends up with a negative situation. And it's not that it happens overnight. This can happen over a lengthy period of time where the victim, the potential target of the manipulator, doesn't realize that they are slowly being led to a point of no return where they will end up being controlled. What started off as something completely sort of enchanting for them, where they're being admired and praised, ends up where they are being controlled and they may not be able to escape that situation. And there's many other subtle forms of manipulation as they can appear in everyday situations, even in friendships. A person constantly appears to be in crisis. Every week there is a new emergency, a new emotional collapse. You listen, you support them, you choose to be compassionate with them, but gradually something strange becomes visible. The crises never stop, and whenever you try to create distance, guilt appears. You're the only one who understands me. You've changed. You used to care more. At that moment, something uncomfortable becomes clear. The relationship was never built on mutual support, it was built on emotional leverage. It was built on manipulation. Manipulation often hides behind vulnerability. And this is how a lot of friends end up controlling another friend, because they keep giving them the guilt trip if they try to move away, because they keep presenting crises, keep presenting their problems for the others to keep trying to solve. And when people get tired of them, or they feel that they're being drained by this friendship, the so-called manipulator makes them feel guilty if they want to break that friendship or move away. Psychologists have given this dynamic a name, which is called validation dependency. So when someone relies heavily on external approval to feel secure, they become easier to influence, because the manipulator controls the supply of validation. Just think about that for a moment. That how many of us may have fallen victim to this without realizing the praise that we are seeking, the reward that it generates, the dopamine rush that it generates for us, ends up becoming a tool to control us. Withdrawal of that becomes punishment. So behavior slowly adjusts to regain approval. This dynamic appears in these friendships and toxic relationships and controlling organizations, as I mentioned the cult example earlier. So the more desperately somebody relies on external approval and validation, the easier it is to control them. The person manipulating his target knows what the victim thrives on. And that victim thrives upon external validation and approval. And this is what they keep feeding them with. And it becomes easier to control their target. And the victim doesn't know that they are feeding the person that is trying to manipulate them with the tools, with the ammunition to be able to control them. This dynamic people very rarely realize. Ancient wisdom also highlighted these vulnerabilities that exist within a human being long before modern psychology studied them formally. Within Islamic teachings, people are taught and warned against deception, arrogance, and blind following. Spiritual scholars emphasize humility and self-awareness precisely because these qualities protect the mind from manipulation. A person who has disciplined their desires and fears becomes harder to influence, because when you are manipulated, people target your desires or your fears. So this is how you become a target for them to be able to be easily controlled, because manipulation succeeds where the ego remains unaware. Manipulators succeed where the ego is blind, unregulated, and has not been disciplined. This leads us to the most important insight in this whole entire discussion: how to defend yourself from being manipulated. And the strongest defense against manipulation is not suspicion. It is self-knowledge, because the more clearly we understand our own emotional needs, the harder it becomes for someone else to exploit them. Because if you knew that loneliness makes you vulnerable to admiration, you become cautious when someone offers sudden affection. If you knew that praise of any sort strongly affects and influences your decisions, you too become alert to flattery. If you knew belonging matters deeply to you, you become careful around the groups that demand unquestioning loyalty. This kind of self-awareness does not eliminate manipulation completely, but it makes manipulation far more difficult, because someone who understands your ego can influence you, but someone who understands their own ego cannot be easily controlled. So the person who understands your ego can influence you, but the person who understands their own ego cannot be easily controlled. This is the most important realization that you need to understand, that others are exploiting you because you do not have this self-awareness about yourself. And if you knew about yourself more than what others know, then you will be able to protect yourself from being exploited. And just also, to others it seems like common sense, especially when you see, it's probably a crude example to mention, but sometimes you'll see an older, not so good looking, attractive woman online being wooed by a good looking younger man, and without having met them, without having even spoken to them, they start giving them money. Then others are quite right to make that judgment that you have to be really mad, lacking common sense to fall into that trap. But obviously people don't realize the emotional battles that people are fighting inside of them, which make it easier for others to be able to exploit them.